Welcome back to My So-Called Disabled Life. I'm so glad you can join us for part 2 of a great interview with Dr. Arielle Silverman. Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for joining us again. Now, I want to really deep dive into your book because I think it was really, really profound. I found it a very good read and could be of interest to our audience. You said in your book, being a 15-year-old blind girl in the side of the world where everyone thought I was either an inspiration or an invalid. How do you view yourself now? Do you view yourself as an inspiration, or do you honestly view yourself as an invalid, or somewhere in between, or neither at all?
I don't think I ever viewed myself in either of those ways, but I was tired of other people sometimes viewing me as one way or the other, and sometimes viewing me as both ways at the same time. So I always wanted to be viewed as an ordinary individual. You know, I'm an ordinary 37-year-old woman. I have a house, I have a job, I have a husband, and I also happen to be blind. I also happen to be female, and I happen to have brown hair, and I have a lot of other characteristics. But I think as a teenager, it seemed like I was viewed in the extremes. So people either thought I was extremely smart and articulate and wise and had so much to offer, or they thought I could barely tie my own shoes or walk down the street. And sometimes people even express both views at the same time. And I just wanted to and I envied my peers who did not have disabilities, because it seemed like they were just treated like normal people, and they were ordinary people, and they were allowed to act their own age and do what they wanted to do and not have their actions glorified or infantilized.
Right. You speak a lot about your family in this book, especially about your childhood, your parents, your grandfather, your siblings. You have a sister. Is that the only sibling you have?
Yeah, just the one sister.
Okay. Now, do you think you call your parents devoted but protective parents? Do you think there was any difference in how they raised you and your sister? Did they handle you with kid gloves?
I think in certain ways, yes. I think especially my mom. And it's hard to disentangle how much of it was because of my disability and how much of it was because I was a younger child. And I imagine that a lot of mothers feel more protective of their youngest children. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But I could definitely pick up on, and I mean, of course, like siblings always compare to each other, how they're being treated, or they think the other one's getting more or is being treated better or whatever. And some of it might have been just in my head, but I think there was definitely a difference. But I think also we were different personality wise, and she was a lot more, in many ways, was a lot more assertive than I was. And so if she felt like she wasn't getting something that she deserved, she would speak up, and I maybe didn't always do that. So some of the differences could have been because of our personalities, and some of it was age, and some of it was disability.
Okay. Now, your dad was the one who worked with you originally to learn Braille. Is that correct?
Early on, although, I mean, both of my parents definitely did. I don't know exactly how things were divided up between the two of them. My dad talks about teaching me the original alphabet. And I think my mom maybe worked with me more when I was actually reading full books. But I honestly don't remember exactly how it was divided up between the two of them.
Okay, I understand that. Now, your parents were really attentive and really helped you along. Now, have you met other people who did not have parents that were as involved with their blind child? And was there any difference to your experience and their experience?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't go into a lot of details in the book without violating people's privacy, but a lot of my friends that I talk about in the book had, challenging family situations where they had two homes, they would go back and forth, or they had parents who were dealing with their own physical or mental health challenges, and so they didn't get that same level of attention, or they had to deal with other stress in the home that was unrelated to their blindness. And in terms of differences, I think they definitely suffered challenges that I did not. I think they also had to be resilient, and they had to build skills that I maybe didn't have to worry about until I was an adult and on my own. And so in some ways, my friends came out with more kind of adaptability and problem-solving skills than I did, because I didn't really have to worry about those types of things until I was older.
I understand. Now, you also speak a lot about your grandfather and very highly of your grandfather and the debates that you would get into with him. And you said that you wondered, he passed away, what would it be, 25, 27 years ago?
I guess now it would be 26.
26 years
26,
ago?
yeah.
Okay. And you said you wondered what he would think. What do you think he thinks of your life?
I really don't know. I discussed it with my parents, and my dad, his son said, Grandpa would absolutely be proud of you and would love your husband and all that. And I'd like to believe that's true. I don't really know. There were some choices I made, like, for example, becoming less involved with my Jewish religious faith as I've gotten older, and marrying someone who is not Jewish. And I don't know if Grandpa or Grandma would have approved of that necessarily. I would hope that, as time has gone by and that we're in a new generation where that happens more frequently than it did in their day, that they would accept it. But I just don't know.
Okay. That's fair. Now, it wasn't meant to be lighthearted, but it was a story that you told in the book about race, and you actually did not know your own race. Do you mind telling me about that?
Yeah, so when I wrote about this in chapter 4, so I was in second grade, and we had the Friday before Martin Luther King Day, they showed a video in class about the civil rights movement and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and all that. I mean, just of course, a very abridged second grade version of the story. And to my memory, I had never heard of Black people or white people or any of these concepts were just completely foreign to me. So I went home and I asked if I was Black or white. And I remember being very curious. And I think just not comprehending, like, why is there this division? Like, why are Black people being treated, or why were they being treated this way? Like, it didn't make sense to me. And of course it still doesn't in a lot of ways. And what really stood out to me is when I asked this question, I asked a lot of questions as a child. And most of them were pretty easy to answer, and some of them were less so. But when I asked about my race, and I thought it was a simple question, there was this hesitation, or my mother just paused for a really long time. And then, she did tell me that I was white, but was also like kind of overcome by emotion and said that, it shouldn't matter. You should, and she said, like, it's so beautiful that you don't know, and that you don't know what race other people are. And, I didn't understand any of it, why it was such a big deal to her or to anybody else. I also noted in the book that I grew up in a suburb that was 92% white. So I think that conversation would have been different if I had been in a more racially diverse place. And I probably would have, I would have heard about it in a different context.
Now, you also speak about discrimination in your book, and that you really didn't see color because you couldn't. Now, do you think it was the fact that you were blind, or do you think it was more the fact that you were yourself a minority by being disabled that allowed you to have empathy for other minority groups? Which one would you pick?
Well, I think the fact that I was a minority allowed me to have empathy. I think it just not being aware of race wouldn't give me empathy. It would just maybe prevent me from expressing racism or developing racial prejudices necessarily in the same way. But in order to really have empathy for other people, I think you need to have some sort of similar experience. So I think the fact that I knew that I was a minority and I attended kind of diversity programs when I was in high school, and then I learned a lot more about race and, cultural diversity and things like that when I was at that program. But the reason that I attended that program and wanted to attend that program is because as a blind person, I was interested in ableism and the discrimination that I dealt with. So I think having that personal experience supported my connection with other people who had a different but similar experience.
I understand completely. Now, here's one thing that you wrote in your book. I don't long for sight anymore than anyone may long for the ability to fly, an invisible coat, X-ray vision, or the ability to read minds. Now, from one disabled woman to another, I kind of find this kind of hard to believe. So are you trying to tell me that if sight was within reach, you wouldn't grab it?
Well, so keep in mind that I've never had sight. And so that experience is going to be different from someone who has had sight maybe for a year of their life. To me, it seems about as foreign as any of these kind of superpower abilities that I wrote about. So, I mean, you might ask, well, if you could be invisible, would you grab that? Or if you could read minds, would you grab that? And I mean, maybe I would. I wouldn't say I absolutely wouldn't do it, but I think there would be a lot of important factors I would need to consider. And honestly, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more set in my ways. And I think the disruption to my lifestyle to have to go and figure out how to handle sight, because I know I've never had it before. I know that getting it, even in the best case scenario, would require a lot of adjustment. And to be able to use sight to its full potential, even to be able to drive or to be able to read small print would take a lot of practice, even in the best case scenario. And I don't know if I want to give up. I have a good job. I have a comfortable life. I don't really love the idea of going to the hospital and going under anesthesia and getting a treatment. And then of course, this is assuming everything goes well, but what if it doesn't? What if there's side effects, or the sight goes away after a couple months, or I don't get as much sight as I was promised? There's a lot of ways that things could go wrong. So I would say in the perfect situation where I was guaranteed to have no problems, I would give it maybe a 6 out of 10 that I would try it.
It's very interesting. And it's very interesting that you pointed out that you never had sight, because we're in a different boat. I suffer from multiple disabilities, but they started at 31. So I had the experience of being completely healthy for 31 years of my life and then delving into a disability. So my view is I would grab it every day. I wish that I didn't have to deal with what I deal with on a daily basis. But thank you for clarifying the fact that, you never had it. So it's like, how can you miss something you never had?
Right. I mean, you can fantasize about it in the same way you fantasize about having superhero qualities. Right. But it's not the same as longing for something that you had before that you liked having that is gone.
Right. Exactly. Now let's talk about another part of your book. You said, when we look at the statistics, the birth of a disabled child should not be a surprise. It shouldn't be unexpected. And it's not a loss of anything. And then you go on to say, I believe much of our surprise is denial related to our ingrained fear of disability. Do you think you're being a little bit hard on parents because finding out that they're going to have a disabled child and grieving that, because everyone says they want to have a healthy and happy baby. So when the health is compromised, and then you also, the parent is grieving a loss of what they expected of the child, do you think you're being a little bit too hard on parents with that statement?
Well, I think parents will take it however they feel it hits them. And, parents have a right to react however they're struck by my words. I think my intention is to be hard on the system that's underlying the grief so even this desire to have a healthy, happy child. If you break that down, what does healthy mean? When you think about 1 in 5 kids who, by the time they grow up, will have some sort of disability, are they still healthy? Are they not? We can debate back and forth about that. There's no one answer. But why is it that parents are conditioned to believe that their child should come out a certain way? And then they feel sad when the child doesn't come out a certain way. And that, in my mind, that's different from grief that occurs when somebody suffers a change. If they're born without disability and they get a disability, grieving makes a lot more sense to me than if someone never had, if someone was never non-disabled, they were born with a disability and that's part of who they are. So of course, some parents are going to be, have a hard time with what I'm saying. It is a radical statement, but I think the system needs to be broken down, and we need to think about, why is it that people are surprised? Because they've been taught to expect a child without a disability, but when there's a 1 in 5 chance that expectation will be violated, maybe they shouldn't be expecting that in the first place. And it's not parents' fault, it's the fault of the system.
Okay. Because you go on to write more about parents. Sometimes family members of disabled children are stumped when they hear that their children express interest in careers that seem impossible. They aren't sure what to say to the young disabled boy or girl who aspires to be an astronaut or a fighter pilot or a race car driver. They don't want to dash their dreams of the loved ones, but at the same time, they don't want to instill false hope. So how should parents straddle that line and family members straddle that line?
Well, in that same paragraph or the next paragraph, I suggest some ways that parents can, work with their children if they express a desire to go into a career that might not currently be accessible because of their disability. And I do emphasize that in 15 years, things could change. But I also say that there are adjacent careers in the same field that will probably be accessible. So even if someone can't go into the military because they won't be accepted, which is a socially constructed barrier, but if they won't be accepted in the military, there might be a way that they can work for the Department of Defense, for example. And so parents can nurture kind of the underlying interest without necessarily giving the child the impression that they will definitely be able to be in the military or be a fighter pilot. And honestly, as I say in the book, kids, they're going to figure it out what they can't do. They're going to figure it out without their parents telling them. What they need is encouragement of the underlying intellectual or vocational interests that they have, especially when they're young. By the time they get to be adolescents, there are, standardized tools that they can utilize to explore their interests and the overlap between what they want to do and what's accessible for them.
Okay. There's one more quote that you said in your book that I wanted to ask you about. You said, what if we look around and saw disability around us in the same way we saw other forms of genetic diversity? Some people have blonde hair, some people have brown, some people are redheads. Do you think this statement is kind of downgrading disability?
Well, you can say it's upgrading hair color. I think everyone's experience with disability is different. And there is a point where I say, some people do genuinely suffer from their disabilities that cause pain. For example, nobody can say that pain, it's okay to be in pain. Like, pain is subjectively a bad thing, and you can learn to minimize pain. You can treat it. You can, find ways to make pain less disruptive, but like, it's pain. It sucks to be in pain regardless. Or, depression is another example where by definition, it's feeling sad. So yeah, I mean, that's probably a little bit worse or a little bit more complicated than just having blonde hair. But I think the point is just that we are all different, and that difference collectively enhances our species and our world and our communities. And even, people who have depression, for example, struggle and are deserving of treatment and compassion and, any intervention that can help reduce the negative emotions that they feel. But they still also bring a lot of positive attributes to the work that they do, and they can be more empathetic, and they can, support others who are going through hard times and things like that. And so the people are an asset, even if some aspects of their experience are things that they don't necessarily want.
Okay, well, you know what? I think that is a great point to end on. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You should be very proud of yourself. And I think that your grandfather would be very proud of what you've done, especially professionally. And with this book, Just Human, be sure to check it out by Dr. Arielle Silverman. Thank you so much. And can I count on you for possibly being on the show in the future?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, that is great to hear. I appreciate that. Have a wonderful day.